Welcome back. It's nice to see you all again. That's part of the event this afternoon. We have 4 speakers, and we will start with Dr. Masita Anwar from Monash University's IT faculty, who will share with us her ideas on a lot of issues we really are interested. But I don't want to steal the show, and I will let her introduce the topic and tell us this interesting issue and give us some ideas on how to mitigate risk in this area and so on. But also I want to mention, and this opportunity, I want to take advantage of this opportunity to thank Dr. Anwar for her contribution to the Somali community, which more of this she will probably tell us. And without further ado, I want to welcome Dr. Anwar. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you so much, Mohammed. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Mohammed, for inviting me to this symposium. I really appreciate it, and nice to meet with Somalian community here in Australia as well as overseas. Yeah, as Mohammed mentioned, my name is Misita Anwar. I am a lecturer at Department of Human-Centered Computing at the Faculty of IT, Monash University. Originally, I came from Indonesia, but I spent about 10, 11 years already in Australia. Yeah. My research is mainly around community informatics, using socio-technical approach, looking at the impact, use, and of technology to people and communities mainly. So I work a lot with communities here in Australia as well as overseas, in Indonesia, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. Actually, as Mohammed also mentioned briefly, we have this collaboration project looking at the awareness, cybersecurity awareness with different communities in Australia, and one of the communities we're working with, Mohammed, is the Somalian community. So I might ask for your contribution at the end to fill in our survey, if you don't mind. I'll put the link, or Mohammed can put the link for you to access, and thank you in advance for willing, if you do, to fill that survey. Okay, so I might not need much time to speak today. What I want to share is briefly around the concept of digital identity and present some opportunities as well as the challenges associated with digital identity development in around the world, as well as like how should government and private institutions can work together to implement digital identity in a way that maximize the benefit and reduce some of the risk, as we will explain later. Okay, so to start with, those of you in Australia, you probably have experienced this like me. How many times do you have to check in every day when you go into anywhere with the COVID, right? How many times do you have to check in if you go to the mall, if you go to other places, offices, schools, yeah? In this post-COVID time, we are increasingly providing more information for the benefit of the society, right? That, like our locations, where we're going, where do we check in? You might also experience like how many times you have to provide your COVID certificate when you go into a restaurant, for example, yeah? And some places are very strict. Some places is quite lenient, but I've experienced this myself, that I was about to go into this restaurant and looks really nice restaurant, but I'm not sure if the food is even nice, right? So I went in show my digital certificate. And the guy said, oh, sorry, you can't come in. You have to have a photo ID with you.
Mm.
But I didn't have my photo ID at the time because I thought, hey, I've got my certificate. Why do I need a photo ID? And the guy said, oh, you might be those people who anti-vaccine and you might steal someone's certificate and to get in. So why would I steal someone's certificate just to get in for food? I don't even know your food is good enough. Yeah, but that's it, right? You can be denied basic service because you can't provide the right identity.
Mm.
So it becomes prevalent that we need to show identifications everywhere these days. It's the basic to access many services. You need to prove that you are what you say, you are who you are before getting many of the service, right? But imagine, what if you lost this ID? So maybe it's burned in a fire, you lost it somewhere, or the institution issuing this ID is non-functional or cease to exist, or a state, a country cease to exist, those state who provides you with this ID. So what would you do then? You may say, well, just create a new one, right? Easy. But the reality is not that easy because most of the time, creating one ID will probably need a different sort of ID. So you'll end up with, like, for example, if you want to make a passport, you will need a birth certificate, right? So if you don't have your certificate, you won't be able to have your passport. If you don't have your birth certificate, you won't be able to have a basic, the national ID, for example. Yeah. So one ID requires other ID. So it's like an endless search. You need to have at least one basic ID. But as we have witnessed, and I know this personally, that creating, having an ID is not as simple as we think for many people. And this happens to my father-in-law. He doesn't have a birth certificate. Like in the olden days, in my country, people do not have birth certificate, right? So when the requirement to have birth certificate came, my father-in-law was about 27 or 28. And then he registered as a civil servant, government officials. But then he didn't have his certificate, so he had to make one. But what happened is, okay, what's your date of birth? I don't know my date of birth. It was somewhere around 1st of November or 6th. Is it 42? Or no, probably, oh, I'll make it 45 to make me a little bit younger. Right? So you created this record was not exist previously. So you have a way to create one that suits what you need, right? And yeah, so that's one story. Perhaps some of you may have watched a movie called Terminal. This is what happened when you don't have your personal your identification. The movie talks about a guy from somewhere, a fictitious Balkan countries, who went to America, I think it was, and then when he came, his country is in a state of war, which makes his ID void. And then he couldn't go into America. So he's just roaming around in the airport for indefinite time, waiting for his ID to be recognized again. Yeah, so basically when the war ended. So that's another example where ID is very important.
Mm.
So that's the point. Yeah, for many people, getting ID is difficult or even impossible.
Mm.
According to World Bank, more than 1.1 billion people do not have ID. More than 1.1 billion in the world unable to prove their identity and therefore lack access to vital services, including healthcare, social protection, education, and finance.
Mm.
And the majority of these people live in Africa and Asia. What's more important is that a third of these 1.1 billion population having no ID are children who
Mm.
are basically unregistered. So, as I mentioned, more than 1.1 billion people live without identity. They lack access to these services. What's more, women and childcare are the most vulnerable. Yeah,
Mm.
so no matter what is the problem, it could be refugee problem, economic inequality, human trafficking, financial inclusion, you care about your identity. Yeah. In fact, 10 of the Sustainable Development Goals can't be met without closing this identity gap. And there is also human rights, and this identity is basically human rights, right? Everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. That's what the UN Human Rights article said.
Mm.
So there is dignity, then there is opportunity in being able to prove um, your identity. So with the over 1 billion people who can't prove this identity, we can see this as a huge crisis, really. And there has been urgencies to address these problems, and it's at many levels, and also to try and harness the power of information technology to address it digitally. Yeah, and it's timely as well because I think somewhere I read like 50% of world population now has access internet, even more so using mobile devices. So we can see more and more in many places that our relationship with institutions and governments and or states, they are increasingly happening in cyberspace. So what is this digital identity? At its core, it's basically using digital technology to prove your identification, to prove that you are you. This outcome-based definition of digital ID here is that also that unlike paper-based ID, like your driver license or a passport, a digital ID can be authenticated remotely over digital channels. And that's because it's, as as I mentioned before, it's using digital technology to prove your identification, which means then you can be identified, you can be authenticated remotely over digital channel. And this definition can be applicable regardless of the issuing identity. So for example, digital ID could be issued by a national or local government, by a consortium or a private or non-profit organization, right? This definition also applies regardless of the specific technology used to perform this digital authentication. And they could range from biometric, password, pins, smart devices, and security tokens. So any technology that we use that are connected to internet at some point we are basically presenting some kind of digital identity. So the basic question is not that it will happen, it's already happening as we see later, but how this will happen. How can we, as society, address the community identity crisis, but at the same time preserve human dignity and privacy? That's the challenge. So let us see how things unfolded first, yeah? So it starts with the United Nations and World Bank ID for Development Committee initiatives that aim to provide everyone a legal identity by 2020. Then they had this ID 2020 summit back in May 2016 to initiate discussions around digital identity, things like blockchain, cryptographic technology, and as well as its benefit to those who are disadvantaged. Soon after, then the ID 2020 Alliance was created. It's based in New York. There are many NGOs participate in that alliance, including Accenture, Microsoft, Rockefeller Foundation, as well as IDEO.org. So numerous, after that, following at the launch, numerous national EID programs and mobile-based scheme were launched or initiated as part of this alliance creation. So these examples include projects from Algeria, mobile ID in Belgium, Cameroon, Ecuador, Jordan, Japan, many other countries, and major announcement in countries like Afghanistan, Denmark, Bulgaria, Philippines, Liberia, Maldives, and many more. Some of these programs now include biometrics, the majority in the form of fingerprints. In UK, a scheme started in 2016, and then on Australia launched its first phase of digital identity program back in 2017. France announced its national ID in 2019. Germany follows in 2020. Canada as well start with the scheme called Pan-Canadian Trust Framework in 2018. And this one you probably know most, it's Aadhaar. It's in the Indian National EID scheme, which crossed 1 billion users by 2016. And at the end of 2020, almost 1.2 billion Indian residents got their Aadhaar ID. So, and this is a digital identity that can be based on biometrics and demographic data. So far, the state of digital ID is mixed. 40 or more national and non-national digital identity programs exist today. Roughly 1.2 people, as mentioned, is registered with Aadhaar. And there are more programs running with government service in Norway, Sweden, and Estonian EID, which has been quite successful in transitioning the e-government service. In Somalia, from what I can gather, I believe that in 2018, Somalian government officials met with World Bank, USAID, and other department partners to discuss the Somali National Identity Program. And the aim was to provide a foundational identification system to delivery service services by the Somalian government, as well as civil society and development partners, and some of the private sector based on biometrics. They also said that this is to make sure that the Somali citizens and eligible residents are provided with identification credentials. The UN Migration recently a deployment of fingerprints readers to Somalian ports of entry to assist with the border management effort. Yeah. So the technology needed for digital ID is now ready and more affordable than ever for emerging economies from those paper-based approaches to identifications. So we can start from looking at the benefits of digital ID, and the benefits to refugees, homeless, and marginalized and structurally poor people are most pressing. When well conceived, digital ID will benefit everyone. So according to McKinsey study here, 3.2 billion people are already part of an active participants in digital world, but facing growing complexity still on security challenges that can potentially be addressed with digital ID. Another 3.4 people on the blue circle there has some form of ID that will, but limited access to digital services. Moving them to digital ID would allow them to get benefits that digital service can offer. Then finally, as we mentioned, there are the 1 billion people with no ID for whom, which is then for whom this need is most urgent. Let us discuss a little bit more on the opportunities of digital ID. It holds promise to enabling economic value creation for each of these three groups by increasing formalization, which could help reduce fraud, protect rights, and increase transparency. It can also promote digitization, which drives efficiencies and ease of use. So the benefit of providing a secure, reliable digital identities can speak for itself. But let me give you some more numbers to convince you that there are opportunities associated with digital ID. Is that digital ID can provide financial inclusion to 1.7 billion people. It can save 110 billion hours of standing in a queue for government services. And potentially, most importantly, it can unlock 6% increase in GDP, according to McKinsey research, 6% increase in GDP for developing countries, and 3% for developed economy. In their study, McKinsey stated that digital ID can create economic value for countries primarily by enabling greater formalization of economic flows and promoting higher inclusion of individual to a range of service. Oops, sorry, that was something in the background. Their analysis of countries like Brazil, China, Ethiopia, India, Nigeria, and UK, as well as US, indicate that individual countries could unlock economic value equivalent to between 3 to 13% of GDP in 2030. Digital ID can also help reinforce rights nominally enshrined in law. For example, in India, the rights of residents to claim subsidized food through ration shops is protected now because of the other identity and claim and is authenticated through that ID system rather than by the discretion of local officials. So it provides greater legal protection. It eliminates child labor and help enforce problems like against a child marriage. Transparency is another benefit of digital ID. So if we have, for example, an accurate, up-to-date death registration systems can help curb social protection for fraud, and a reliable, authentic voter registry is essential to reduce voter fraud and ensure the whole integrity of the electoral process. So as you can see, there are big opportunities that can be realized with digital identity, providing that it is implemented correctly. But as with any other technology, right, they come with a double-edged sword. So with technology like digital ID, you can see the opportunity, but there are also dangers, which is why digital ID needs to be carefully and thoughtfully implemented, carefully designed and thoughtfully implemented, because if not, it can be more dangerous than having no ID at all. We will discuss some of this danger. First, there is a danger of exclusion. You intended for people to use this digital ID, but there are still people at risk of inclusion as this system becomes prevalent in our everyday life. There can be individuals without sufficient technological access or savvy, and those who do not trust digital IT systems. They can be at risk of completely excluded unless alternative manual options also exist, right? So if somebody does not have a way to prove who they are, and when more and more services are requires this kind of proof of identity, there is a risk that these people are cut off from services. So there is a danger of leaving people behind. Again, example from Aadhaar, there were reports that as it was rolled out, there are people who were literally starving because they can't get food subsidy that they used to have. What happened was because the proof of identity was made requirement for this food program. So those who are not registered or were unable to register back then, they can't access the food benefits and literally starve because of it. Another example is the introduction of the biometric systems by the UN World Food Program in Yemen. Because they suspect corruption, the aid program demanding the Houthi officials to allow them to deploy biometrics technologies. But then the officials paint this as intelligence operation. So what happened? There was a standoff between the aid organization and the Houthi government, Houthi officials. This led to aid organization to decide to suspend food aids to parts of the starving population unless the Houthis allows biometrics. So this is one example where digital ID could impact on most vulnerable citizens. Other problems, yeah, indeed, like connectivity and information sharing also contribute to potential dangers, data breach. Yeah, so there are people, institutions that for some reason may or are able to abuse the systems. And these abuse range from things like discrimination, denial of rights, or facilitation of genocide and ethnic cleansing. It is happening now, as we see, like with the amount of reports that some of you may have read on the use of these kind of systems in facilitating discriminations to the Chinese ethnic minority. And we know this is not new, right? It happens throughout the history. Remember how IBM works with the Nazi in the World War II, helping facilitate Nazi genocide through generation and tabulation of punch cards based upon the national census data. Even programs designed with best intention can also be abused, like the reports from the ID program in New York launched in 2015, where they collect a lot of data from 1 million immigrants who registered to that system. But then there was concern that those data, which consist of hundreds and thousands of foreign passport, birth certificate, driver license, sitting in a data storage somewhere. And the concern was that when Trump's administration came into power, that it is possible that some of this data might be used to facilitate things like arrest and discrimination. So here we can think that not only we need to think whether we trust the administration, the state, the institution that are currently dealing with our data, but also those who might come into power in the future. Because basically, although we may think we have control over our data, actually we are not. Yeah, if you use Facebook, if you use Yahoo, if you use Google, most probably your data have been compromised. Most likely it's not secure, we're not in control, and there are always people who will exploit this data for economic or other gains. Yeah, so those are brief overview on the danger that can present with the introduction of systems like digital ID. So what's important is to have a good digital ID. It needs to be designed well, it needs to be implemented carefully to have a good digital ID. This ID needs to be personal. It should be unique and it's only for the person. It should be persistent. It should be lives with you from birth to death. It should be private. You can choose who you want to share your data, what data you want to share, and it should be portable. You should be able to access your personal data no matter where you are across geographical borders. This is an example of Australian proposed digital identity. So Australia's digital identity legislation has started its public consultation on the exposure draft of the Trusted Digital Identity Bill. It ended last November. The proposal claims safe, secure, convenient system. Your digital ID helps you prove who you are when you want to access service online. So this is what has been written on the digital identity website. It also provides these principles that sounds very good and relate to most of what we think of as the good digital ID. It's convenient. You can use it anywhere, anytime. It's efficient, it's private, it's secure. Yeah, so it sounds like a very good plan. In fact, I might show you whether if we have some time, I might show you what the video.
Your digital identity is a simple, safe, and secure way of proving who you are. It's convenient. You can use it on the go at any time of day. It's secure, so you don't need to remember passwords for services you rarely use. And you can be confident your information is private and protected. It can save you time. You don't have to wait to access the services you need. Set it up once, then reuse it again and again, whenever you need to prove who you are.
So very good plan, a very good promise from the Australian digital identity there, I think. It does sound like a good digital ID indeed. But remember, this is only the consultation process, right? We will have to see we will need to see its implementation and how they will do it. In fact, how can we do this? So surely technology like cryptographically protected distributed systems, they can provide privacy and security. They can allow for better portability and verifiability. But this model will not appear on their own from the technology side alone. Also, thoughtful system design, as I mentioned before, with built-in privacy provisions like data minimizations and robust governance. When we need to establish the rule of law and to guard the system against the risks that we mentioned before. To help promote sustainable digital ID systems that minimize risk, the World Bank Group and the Center for Development facilitated the development of 10 principles on identification for sustainable development. It's outside the scope of the current presentation, but we can discuss later in the discussion time if anyone's interested. Yeah. So in conclusion, that the digital ID is happening now as we see it, and it's important to choose the path of privacy, making sure that our data is secure and private. And there is a need for better cooperation between institutions and governments to make this happen. We need a agreement, better understanding of principles and design, as well as standards to make these systems recognized, to make it effective, as well as trusted. And perhaps you can appreciate that this is not only a technological problem, but more of human challenges. We need to have better cooperation and partnership between private and government entities to set the current and future course of digital ID, as well as navigating its risk. Thank you so much. I think that's that short presentation should facilitate any discussions that we can have after this. Thank you. And yeah, if any comments or any questions, feel free to put them in a Q&A.
Thank you very much, Dr. Anwar. That was very, very useful. I enjoyed that, and I'm sure we'll hear from other people as well who are watching this. But if there are any questions or comments, by no means, please raise your hand and the floor is open. While waiting for questions, maybe I'll take advantage of that opportunity and maybe I'll ask you a question, Dr. Anwar, if you don't mind. I'm just interested, are there best practice or a model where we can say that's the best way to do ID card or identification card? Or is every country just doing their own thing? I'm just wondering whether there is like a golden standard or something that everyone can look up to, please.
It's quite difficult because yeah, as you mentioned, right, different countries, different jurisdictions have different situation, and there are things that exist like that sorry, what did I mention before? There is that thing like the principles of digital ID, right, for sustainable development developed by World Bank, that can be used. And there are also other frameworks, regulations around privacy and data regulation and in cross-border regulations. But things like GDPR in Europe can be one reference in making sure these privacy protections and cross-border data protection as well, regulation. I just recently read that China also has started their cross-border data regulation framework. So while there are those principles and frameworks and regulations, I think every countries will need to choose approach that are suitable for its own environment, like, and there are political issues and different situations that might affect that.
Any questions, comments?
Yeah, I was going to ask Mohammed and Misita, thanks for that presentation, very interesting.
Thank you.
I was wondering specifically in the context of Somalia, and there, especially in the context of the elections. I don't know if you have the answer to that, Misita, or maybe Mohammed or somebody else on the panel. From what I've heard, so the election now, the current elections, are again not one person, one vote, right? Like previous ones. And it has been the aim to have a one person, one vote election for a while now. And I think it was hoped that this one might be one, but again, it is not. There's only a subset of, I can't remember, a significant number of people, I think thousands or even tens of thousands of representatives who then elect the actual parliamentarians. And I was wondering, is the issue that's preventing that from happening, one person, one vote, is the issue identity, the lack of identity, be it digital or conventional? Because I think in Somalia, it's even a challenge to have a non-digital ID for everyone, like an ID card, a physical ID card, simply because of the remoteness of many areas, insecurity and so on. Is that what's preventing one person, one vote, or is it other more general issues like, again, the remoteness of some areas where people live, or insecurity, that areas are not accessible? Is the ID the issue, or other issues?
Well,
Maybe Mohammed, you are in better position to.
Well, I'm not really sure whether I'm in any better position than anyone. What goes on in Somalia is very complex, very interesting. I wish I knew the answer, but but I'll try. I'll have a go at this. There are many variables that are causing the election delay or the complications in the political scene in Somalia. But certainly, yes, ID card is one of the problems. In fact, we can even widen the discussion into identity itself. You know, the Somali identity, who is Somali? But that's a little bit beyond the scope of this discussion. But if we just talk about the technical aspects of the ID cards or identity card for Somali citizen, it was tried. In fact, Peter, when you were in Somalia, there was an ID card. I even had one, and there were problems. There were technical problems. Some of them unnecessary, really. They were like one-on-one stuff, you know, like even having deadline. You know, when you are citizen of a country or you're not, there's no such thing as a deadline. So in other words, it had an expiry date. Certain peculiar characteristics that were really meaningless. But without not going into the detail of all of that, yes, it does contribute to the delay of not only the election, but also other services. But it's not a lack of trying. It's been tried. In fact, there was an expert, Somali expert, who worked even in the presidential office for that particular purpose. But for some reason, it didn't continue, just like many other issues about Somalia. But there were also other interesting ideas. Personally, I have a selfish interest in this area because I was interested from a technical perspective. And now just very quickly summarize what I was trying to do, and I'm still trying to do, is how do you get unique ID number? And we tried to patent, if you can believe this, we even tried to patent the idea of using, in the internet, we have this IB addresses, IB version 4 and IB version 6. So when IB version 4 was exhausted, the question was, now we use IB version 6, which is in the billions and billions. So that means there are enough, not only for Somalia, but maybe for the whole world, to have a unique IB version 6 number. So what I was trying to do, and I'm still trying to do, keeping that idea, I want to actually patent this, to come up with an ID number on the ID card that partly contains an IB version 6 address. Now, you might think this is kind of a sci-fi idea, but just imagine, let's just imagine, I think Dr. Anwar would be interested from my tea at Monash University. My days when I was at Monash, IB version 4 was enough for everyone. But just imagine if the idea works, then what that really means is you can have parts of the IB version 6 for every citizen. Now, this will make the spooks, you know, the intelligence community very happy, because what that means is that once and for all, we know every person from that ID, if they use that IP address or that ID card for their computer or their mobile, then we can link that person to that computer. So there will never be a dispute to say, I didn't use that computer because it's your computer. How do we know? Because it's your ID number. In other words, linking the ID number on the ID card to your IP address on your computer. But it's work in progress. That is my selfish interest, and I'm working on that. But coming back to you, Peter, yes, lack of ID is a major problem in Somalia and many other countries, and I'm sure it's delaying not only the election but other services as well.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it's probably all followed in the news in the US. The issue of election laws being changed in some states, now requiring ID, which it was not in the past, which is interesting. And the same here in Australia. It's when you go and vote, there's no ID required. Which has always I always found that amazing and surprising. In Germany, where I come from, it's been like that for a long time, that you have to present ID when you go and vote. And I used to think how strange and how dangerous, in terms of improper voting, of not requiring ID. But then I became aware that the discussion in the States and also here in Australia is being discussed, there are apparently a significant number of people who don't have ID, even in countries like here in Australia and in the US. In Australia, I'm told in particular the indigenous population, for example, a lot of them do not have ID, and they would actually be excluded from the election process if ID was required. So it's not as simple and straightforward, especially in a developing country, of requiring ID, any form of ID, be it digital, which had its own challenges. If only 50% of people have a mobile phone or physical ID for election purposes. So
yeah, I can relate to that, Peter, because until now, even recently in the last election, with like in my country, in Indonesia, you still need to present like paper ID to be able to vote. And there are still incidents where people generating this paper ID by millions to get more votes. So what happened, they added additional, they've been doing this for a while now, they added additional measure of preventing people from duplicating vote by dipping your finger in ink, so you can't come twice when you still have your ink in your finger. So the problems, I think, is widely prevalent in many places.
I think Hassan Jama and Liban and Muhammad Gadi and the other Somalis who are watching this will be interested in what you just mentioned, of that idea of using the ink, where you put your finger in the ink, and then that means the authorities can check that you voted for. We're going through an election in Somalia where there's no date, there's no deadline. In other words, the election can go forever. So every day, 2 people can be elected, 3 days. So imagine if that idea was necessary. So you put your finger in the ink, and then 2 weeks later, there's no ink. You can see, I'm just joking about this. No, I shouldn't joke. Actually, it's very serious
with us,
issue.
we have that time limit.
But we're going through very, very difficult time back home. But anyway, that is a little bit beyond the scope of the discussion. I want to thank you, Anwar. If there are no other questions, we have to move on. But let's just wait. I think there's someone, Muhammad Gadi. Yeah, please go ahead. Hello, Muhammad. I can't see him.
He's in. I can see he's in.
Yeah, I want to make him co-host, then he can come online as well. Okay, Mohammed. Hello. I'm not really sure. Can you hear us, Mohammed?
Hello, how are you?
Yeah, go ahead. You have got a question.
Yeah, that was a lovely presentation, Misita. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
My question is which is the greatest question in terms of what's ahead in the future. How do we scale this in a sustainable way, digital ID? So that we can get it across the whole world? And how can that be intermodal between different countries so that that ID is there permanently? And what's the future ahead in terms of that, or what studies are being done at the moment?
Okay, thank you, Mohammed. I think I don't have the answer for how we can sustain this digital ID and to have it forever. Perhaps something like Mohammed ideas about attaching someone's ID to IP address would become would become an option in the future. The only thing the only issue I can think of with the IP address though, because it's a structured numbers. It's not a random numbers, right? So it can be sort of traced easier compared to random ID. Yeah, but in responding to your question, Mohammed, so there are, as I mentioned before, those principles of identification for sustainable development. Following those principles can be considered as one option. But what is more important, and I mentioned this briefly in the presentation, is that because people, countries, and individuals have different perceptions on ethical approach, right? So in designing these technologies, if we're looking at it from the ethical perspective, we need to design these systems according to ethical principles. But since people have different perceptions of ethical principles, then it's not easy, right? So there needs to be an agreement or better understanding on ethical principles in designing this technology to ensure that it is trusted, it is recognized by the states and governments. And I do not have a lot of studies on digital ID papers, but there are a few papers that I've read that elicit the usefulness of technologies like blockchain and cryptography, cryptographically protected, and as well as distributed systems in creating this digital ID. So again, that may relate to Mohammed's idea of the IP, if you connected it through this kind of technology, which I'm not an expert on.
No, the original idea, or the idea about the IB version 6, it's not even to use the whole number. It was a way of combining that with some other number, but then using some other algorithm to change the number as well. But you should be able to reverse engineer and get that IP address. Now, the idea is cool, but of course, governments are governments and authorities are sometimes complicated. Who knows? It might be another PhD to be written, or someone might want to write a book about it. Maybe it's in the pipeline. I shouldn't tell you more about that. Well, are there any other questions or comments for Dr. Anwar before we let her go? I don't want to keep you away from your weekend. So any questions or comments? I think we're a bit quiet. I want to thank you, Dr. Anwar. This was really useful, and we'll look forward for that survey as well and see the outcome from that survey for the community. You didn't say much about that, but I would remind people that they should do the survey, that the cybersecurity survey for the Monash project. So I want to thank you again. Do you have any other last words, Dr. Anwar? Do you want to tell us anything else? Or
no, thank you so much for having me in the symposium, and it's my pleasure to meet other panel member. Nice to meet you, Peter, and other panel member. And yes, with our survey, with the Cyber Migrant Awareness Survey, we aim for that survey to be able to provide a meaningful recommendation to Australian government around the kind of information dissemination as well as training that will be needed for the communities in order to enhance their cybersecurity protections and awareness, basically. So yes, thank you so much. If anyone's interested in filling out that form, is there a way I can put the
sure.
Link, or perhaps
I can send it to this has been to be on Facebook, but I'll add that line again today, and people can get that link as well. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.